The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of blue that seemed to swallow the horizon, reflecting the sunlight like a promise and a warning all at once. For Japan in the late 1930s, this ocean was destiny, a stage for ambition, a pathway for power, and a canvas for innovation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had a vision audacious enough to defy the limits of technology, an aircraft capable of striking distant lands, carrying deadly payloads, and returning home without refueling. The task of making that vision reality fell to Mitsubishi. Within the vast hangars in Nagoya, engineers pored over calculations, models, and prototypes. Every ounce of weight mattered. Armor was sacrificed. Self-sealing fuel tanks, standard in Western bombers, were considered unnecessary. The Navy's requirements were brutal in their simplicity. Speed, range, and payload above all else. Out of this relentless focus, the Mitsubishi G4M emerged, a sleek, fast, almost elegant bomber. To the Allies, it would be the Betty, to the Japanese, Hamaki, the flying cigar. When the first prototypes lifted off, they seemed to defy gravity itself. Pilots felt the raw power of the engines as the coastline fell away beneath them. From the cockpit, the world appeared distant, fragile, and almost insignificant. The bomber's design was breathtaking. Long, cylindrical fuselage, broad wings, engines roaring with controlled fury. But within this beauty lay a fatal flaw. The fuel tanks, thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel, were completely unprotected. A stray bullet, a tracer round, even minor combat damage could turn this marvel into a fireball in seconds. By December 1941, the G4M was ready to strike. From bases scattered across Formosa in Japan, the bombers swept across the Pacific with precision that stunned Allied commanders. Entire airfields, naval vessels, and fleets once considered untouchable were suddenly within reach. The aircraft's range was unmatched. Its speed was extraordinary. Its payload could devastate targets with surgical efficiency. And yet, while it dominated the skies, it carried a silent, insidious danger. The very design choices that made it formidable also made it lethally vulnerable. As the sun rose over the endless Pacific, the Betty soared into history, powerful, precise, and dangerously flawed. Its wings carried the weight of strategic ambition. Its engines, the promise of air superiority, and its unprotected fuel, the hidden cost of victory. Every mission flown by its crews was a gamble. Every sortie a test of skill and fate. The Betty was not merely a weapon. It was a statement, a paradox of brilliance and danger, of capability and sacrifice. In the hands of Japanese pilots, it would strike terror across thousands of kilometers, but it would also claim lives in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. The Mitsubishi G4M was a masterpiece of engineering designed to dominate the skies, to project power across vast oceans, and to achieve what seemed impossible. Yet, embedded in its design was a lesson written in fire, loss, and human cost, a lesson that would unfold across the Pacific and ultimately reveal the stark consequences of valuing performance above survival. December 8, 1941. The morning sun rose over the Philippines, but the calm belied the storm about to break. Far across the ocean, from bases on Formosa, 82 G4M bombers and 26 older G3M bombers began their silent ascent. Their target was Clarkfield, the jewel of American air power in the Philippines. To the men on the ground, there was no warning. Within hours, the course of the Pacific War would be rewritten. At 12:35 p.m., the Japanese formation appeared in the sky, precise, disciplined, and untouchable. Flying at 20,000 feet, they were beyond the reach of the American anti-aircraft guns. The first wave of 27 bombers released 636 bombs with surgical accuracy, tearing across runways, hangars, and parked aircraft. Chaos erupted on the tarmac. Moments later, fighters dove in at treetop level, machine guns raking every surviving plane into burning wreckage. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses, only 5 remained. Every P-40 Warhawk on the field was destroyed or ablaze. In less than an hour, American air power in the Philippines was effectively annihilated. From a bomb shelter, Lieutenant James Harrington watched helplessly as the Japanese formation withdrew, their bombers untouched. Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. he would later record. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne in time. The Betty had struck again, proving its deadly combination of range, speed, and precision. American fighters that scrambled were too late. Entire squadrons had been erased before they could respond. The implications were staggering. These bombers had struck from 460 miles away, a feat no American aircraft could match at that stage of the war. Across the Pacific, the Betty would demonstrate similar dominance, attacking Darwin, Port Moresby, and Guadalcanal, projecting Japanese power across vast stretches of ocean. It was an aircraft that redefined what was possible for land-based bombers, extending Japanese influence farther than anyone had imagined. Yet, beneath the awe, a deadly truth waited. These bombers were magnificent, precise, and devastating, but they were also fragile. Every mission relied on surprise, on limited opposition, on enemy fighters being too far away to challenge them. Behind the sleek fuselage, unprotected fuel tanks made the aircraft a tinderbox. A single hit could ignite catastrophe. Early successes masked this vulnerability, and it would take months of brutal engagements for the Allies to uncover the Betty's fatal weakness. On the surface, the attack on Clark Field was a triumph, a symbol of Japan's ingenuity and the terrifying reach of its air power. But it was also the prelude to a lesson that would come at a terrible cost. The very design choices that gave the Betty its extraordinary capabilities, range, speed, payload, would also define the price paid by its crews. For every successful strike, there was a looming shadow of fire, loss, and destruction waiting in the wings. The Pacific had become a proving ground, and the Betty would leave its mark in both triumph and tragedy. Just 2 days after Clark Field, December 10, 1941, the Betty bombers demonstrated the terrifying reach of Japanese air power once again. This time, their target was a pride of the British Navy. 4C, a task force centered on the modern battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The ships sailed confidently through the South China Sea, unaware that the skies above were about to unleash a storm of destruction. At precisely 12:20 p.m., Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, the culmination of careful planning and meticulous execution. 26 G-4M bombers, accompanied by older G-3M Nell bombers, advanced on their targets, dropping to treetop level as Zero fighters swept in to cover their assault. Each G-4M carried a Type 91 aerial torpedo, a weapon designed for shallow water attacks, capable of ripping massive holes in even the most heavily armored ships. These torpedoes were precise, efficient, and deadly. The first wave struck. Prince of Wales, displacing 43,000 tons, took at least 6 torpedo hits along with level bombing damage. The explosions tore through the hull, overwhelming damage control efforts. The battleship began listing dangerously, the magnitude of destruction astonishing British sailors. Repulse, a modernized battlecruiser, attempted evasive maneuvers but absorbed 4 torpedo hits that proved fatal. Anti-aircraft fire claimed some Japanese aircraft, but it could not prevent the coordinated attacks from hitting their marks. Within hours, both capital ships had capsized and sunk, claiming 841 British lives. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final destruction. Never before had capital ships, actively defending themselves in open sea, been sunk solely by air power. The Betty had rewritten naval warfare. In one devastating strike, the Japanese had shattered British naval superiority in Asia, proving that long-range, land-based bombers could project power in ways no fleet could match. The triumph, however, was a double-edged sword. The Betty's success relied on precise coordination, surprise, and the assumption of minimal opposition. At this point in the war, American and Allied forces had not yet developed the capability to intercept or challenge these bombers effectively. Their speed, range, and weapon payload created an asymmetric advantage that seemed insurmountable. From the Philippines to New Guinea, from Darwin to Guadalcanal, Japanese bombers struck targets with impunity, leaving Allied commanders scrambling to respond. Yet, beneath the apparent invincibility of the Betty, the seeds of vulnerability were already present. The same design choices enabled it to outrange any opponent. Unprotected fuel tanks, minimal armor, and stripped-down weight would later reveal catastrophic consequences. For now, however, the Pacific theater was a stage upon which the Betty reigned supreme. Its early strike set a precedent, instilling both fear and awe, while foreshadowing a grim calculus. Extraordinary capability came at extraordinary human cost. As the smoke cleared over 4C, the reality of the Betty's dual nature became undeniable. It was a weapon of unmatched range and precision, yet fragile, a paradox that would define the air war in the Pacific. For the crews aboard, every mission carried the weight of this paradox, a promise of glory shadowed by the specter of fire and death. The Pacific War had truly begun, and the Betty bomber had announced its arrival in unforgettable, devastating fashion. BY early 1942, the Betty bomber had become an unstoppable symbol of Japanese air power. Across the Southwest Pacific, Allied forces encountered these aircraft in nearly every engagement, their presence a constant reminder of Japanese reach and audacity. From Darwin, Australia, to the islands of New Guinea, from Port Moresby to Guadalcanal, the Betty struck targets that seemed impossibly distant, moving with a speed and range that few Allied planes could match. The Japanese pilots, flying from airfields hundreds of miles from their targets, were executing missions that tested both endurance and skill. Each sortie demanded precision navigation across vast expanses of ocean and rugged terrain, yet the Betty, with its enormous fuel capacity and lightweight design, enabled these feats with a confidence that American and Allied pilots could scarcely imagine. To the untrained eye, it seemed invincible, able to appear suddenly, strike devastating blows, and vanish before any counterattack could materialize. But even as the Betty's dominance grew, the aircraft's vulnerabilities lurked in plain sight. Its unprotected fuel tanks, a design choice made years earlier prioritized range over survivability, meant that a single well-placed hit could turn a mission of strategic impact into a fiery disaster. Early reports from Allied pilots began to hint at this weakness. Planes that looked sleek and untouchable in the sky could explode instantly if struck in the wing or fuselage. Yet, in the first half of 1942, Allied fighter strength was dispersed, reaction time slow, and radar coverage limited. These factors allowed Betty formations to operate with deadly effectiveness, often striking without interception and returning largely intact. The early successes of the Betty were not only tactical victories, they were psychological weapons. Airfields, ports, and naval installations came under constant threat. Darwin itself suffered repeated strikes, revealing the sheer audacity of Japanese operational planning. At Port Moresby, Betty bombers crossed New Guinea's treacherous mountains, demonstrating capabilities that seemed almost superhuman. On Guadalcanal, from the airfield at Rabble, the aircraft projected power over hundreds of miles of ocean, reaching American positions that Allied planners had considered safe. Every mission further demonstrated the paradox of the Betty, a bomber engineered for dominance, yet carrying the seeds of its own destruction. Its enormous range allowed it to strike almost anywhere, but its lack of protective measures meant that success depended entirely on the absence of effective opposition. This delicate balance between capability and vulnerability defined the aircraft's operational history, shaping every engagement and influencing Allied strategy. The early months of the Pacific War were dominated by the Betty's shadow. Japanese planners celebrated its range and speed, while Allied commanders scrambled to understand how to counter an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere. For the crews inside, each flight was a mixture of triumph and terror, a chance to achieve striking distance over enemies, yet a constant risk that a single bullet could ignite fuel and doom them all. By mid-1942, the narrative was clear. The Betty bomber was a formidable instrument of war, but one whose extraordinary strengths hid an Achilles heel. Its successes were brilliant, yet fragile. Its power undeniable, yet perilously dependent on conditions that would not last. The stage was set for a confrontation that will reveal, in tragic clarity, just how costly the pursuit of unprotected range and speed could be. By August 1942, the fragile invincibility of the Betty bomber began to crumble. The Guadalcanal campaign marked a turning point, where the aircraft's extraordinary range and speed collided violently with the growing strength of Allied fighter forces. On August 8th, a formation of 23 G4M bombers of the 4th Air Group departed from Rabble, heading to strike American positions on Guadalcanal. What had once been a near-guaranteed mission of dominance now teetered on the edge of disaster. American intelligence, radar systems, and fighter deployments had matured. the moment Betty formations crossed into Allied detection zones. They were vulnerable in ways Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. As the bombers neared Savo Island, they encountered a well-prepared intercept force. Fighters from a newly arrived squadrons engaged the formation with deadly precision. Within minutes, the vulnerabilities of the G-4M were brutally exposed. 18 of the 23 bombers were shot down, the majority exploding in midair. Fires consumed fuselages and wings alike, a direct consequence of the unprotected fuel tanks that Major McCoy would later document in meticulous detail. The cost was catastrophic. Approximately 120 Japanese aviators perished in what became the single worst loss for the G-4M in the Pacific Campaign. Survivors recounted the horror. Any strike to the wing or fuselage could instantly transform the bomber into a fireball, leaving no chance for escape. The Betty, once a symbol of unstoppable air power, became an instrument of death for its own crews. The very design that allowed it to reach distant targets now guaranteed that any engagement with capable Allied fighters would end in catastrophe. These losses sent shockwaves through Japanese operational planning. The early doctrine that assumed limited Allied opposition was shattered. Japanese commanders realized, painfully, that the Betty's range and payload were insufficient to ensure mission success when interception became routine. No longer could the aircraft rely on surprise. Its Achilles heel had been exposed, and the heavy price was measured in burned-out fuselages and lost lives. The Guadalcanal encounters illuminated a grim truth. The G-4MS brilliance in design came at an inescapable cost. Engineers had chosen performance over protection, maximizing fuel capacity and speed at the expense of crew survival. Now, reality forced those consequences into stark relief. Every subsequent mission carried the same risk. The longer the campaign dragged on, the heavier the losses became. The aircraft's initial aura of invincibility had evaporated, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability that Allied pilots soon learned to exploit systematically. The early victories of the Betty were now overshadowed by the stark arithmetic of attrition. Japanese formations could no longer operate with impunity. Losses mounted with relentless consistency, each mission compounding the tragedy. Guadalcanal became a testing ground, proving that an aircraft design philosophy, its prioritization capability over protection, was not a theoretical flaw, but a deadly operational reality. The Betty bomber, which had once struck fear across the Pacific, now became a sobering lesson in the cost of design choices divorced from survivability. The August 8th disaster was only the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, the campaign would continue to expose every vulnerability, every flaw, every risk that had been knowingly accepted in pursuit of range and speed. The G-4MS legacy would be rewritten not by triumphs, but by fire, loss, and the heavy toll exacted on the men who flew as August bled into September 1942. The Guadalcanal skies became a proving ground for the grim mathematics of the G-4M Betty bomber. Every mission sent formations of these aircraft into a gauntlet of American fighters, and every mission confirmed the same unflinching truth. The Betty's extraordinary range and speed were irrelevant when survival depended on evading modern, well-positioned interception forces. Japanese pilots, once confident in their ability to strike from distant bases, now faced the stark reality that any hit to the fuselage or wings could ignite a blaze for which escape was impossible. The Japanese Navy attempted to adapt its tactics. Formations flew higher, tighter, and in overlapping patterns to maximize mutual defense, while Zero fighters provided more aggressive escorts. Yet the results remained catastrophic. The unprotected fuel tanks were a silent killer, a design choice that no formation maneuver could overcome. Air crews watched helplessly as comrades erupted in fireballs midair, victims of vulnerability baked into the aircraft's very design. The Betty's elegant, cylindrical fuselage, once celebrated for aerodynamic efficiency, now became a coffin in the sky. American pilots, by contrast, were rapidly refining their approach. They studied the patterns of Japanese attacks, calculated intercept points, and exploited the aircraft's predictable weaknesses. Any damage, no matter how minor, often triggered catastrophic fires. The combination of intelligence, improved fighter performance, and tactical innovation transformed the Pacific Air War. Betty bombers that had once flown with impunity were now systematically hunted and destroyed, proving that the Japanese emphasis on range over protection had created a fatal imbalance. In the cockpit, Japanese crews experienced the terror firsthand. Flight petty officers like Masawato described missions that required climbing into a beautifully engineered machine designed to defy distance, yet engineered to doom its occupants under fire. Every sortie carried the dual weight of expectation and imminent danger. Pilots who survived often did so by the slimmest margin, witnessing the deaths of comrades who had flown the same planes into the same enemy fire. The disparity between design intent and operational reality had become a relentless teacher, exacting a toll measured in smoke, fire, and loss. By late September, attrition rates had escalated to unsustainable levels. The 4th Air Group, which had once formed the backbone of Japan's long-range strike capability in the Solomon Islands, had been decimated. Numbers dwindled as aircraft were destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and seasoned pilots, whose skill had once been a force multiplier, were lost in flames. The strategic implications were immediate. Japan's ability to project air power across the Pacific was weakening, while Allied forces gained confidence and momentum. Efforts to modify tactics or increase escort protection offered only marginal relief. The fundamental flaw remained immutable. The unprotected fuel tanks were an existential vulnerability. Engineers had sacrificed survivability for range, believing the aircraft's reach would be sufficient to deter interception. Reality had proven them catastrophically wrong. Every mission became a race against inevitability, a confrontation between human courage and mechanical compromise. The Betty bomber, once a symbol of Japanese air power's audacity and reach, had been transformed into a cautionary tale of design philosophy in extremis. Guadalcanal revealed that performance without protection was a brittle strategy. It could yield spectacular early victories, but it could not sustain operations against a resilient and technologically adaptive enemy. By the end of September 1942, the story of the Betty was no longer one of triumph, but of attrition, sacrifice, and the deadly cost of choices made years before the first bullet had been fired. By late 1942, the Japanese Navy faced a harsh reckoning. The Betty bomber, once the crown jewel of long-range strike capability, had proven deadly not just to its enemies, but to its own crews. Guadalcanal had revealed the unforgiving truth. Extraordinary range and speed meant nothing when every hit to fuselage or wings could ignite the aircraft in a burst of flames. Japanese engineers and commanders alike were forced to confront the consequences of decisions made in the sterile calculations of the late 1930s. Designers at Mitsubishi had known the risks. Kiro Honjo and his team had sacrificed protection for performance, believing that surprise, initiative, and operational doctrine would shield the bomber from the full force of combat attrition. Early victories seemed to validate this choice, as the G-4M struck Clark Field, Darwin, and the naval force at Malaya with devastating effect. But the strategic environment had shifted. American fighter strength was increasing rapidly. Pilot training had improved, and radar-assisted interception allowed Allied forces to anticipate and counter Japanese attacks. Suddenly, the mathematics of compromise had a lethal human cost. Japanese command attempted incremental modifications, though the technology and industrial capacity available made true solutions impossible. Rubber sheets were added beneath wing surfaces to slow fuel leaks, but these offered only minimal protection. The aircraft's weight budget could not accommodate comprehensive self-sealing tanks or armor plating, without sacrificing the very range that had defined the Betty's operational advantage. Each adjustment was a trade-off, a small mitigation that could not counteract the fundamental flaw. Air crews continued to climb into the bombers with grim resolve. Veterans like Masawato recounted missions where death felt almost certain. Each sortie became an act of calculated bravery or desperate obedience. Pilots were acutely aware that enemy fire, even a few bullets in the wrong place, could turn their elegant high-performance aircraft into an inferno. And yet, military discipline, cultural expectation, and duty compelled them forward. The range that once inspired confidence now demanded courage bordering on fatalism. American pilots, conversely, were learning to exploit every weakness with increasing precision. Intercept tactics were refined. Formation patterns were studied. Fuel tank vulnerabilities were understood and targeted. Flying in, striking with coordinated attacks, and withdrawing, Allied aviators were now turning the Pacific skies into a deadly proving ground for the principles the Japanese had sacrificed for range. Each engagement added to the mounting body of evidence. The Betty's extraordinary capabilities were nullified by the absence of protection. By the end of 1942, the attrition was undeniable. Entire air groups had been decimated. Experienced pilots were lost in flames, and replacements were forced into missions for which they were ill-prepared. The G4MS theoretical advantages were being systematically eroded by practical reality. Operational losses highlighted a stark contrast in design philosophy. American bombers were built to return crews home, even when damaged. Japanese bombers were built to reach the target, even if the crew did not. Guadalcanal had proven that, when the assumptions of limited opposition and strategic surprise were invalid, the mathematics of performance over protection yielded catastrophic results. The story of the Betty at this point had shifted. It was no longer a symbol of audacious Japanese air power. It had become a cautionary tale of design philosophy under fire. It illustrated that technological achievement divorced from realistic operational assumptions could produce a weapon as dangerous to its own operators as to its enemies. The stage was now set for the next evolution. Further Japanese attempt to modify the G4M to survive, and the unfolding consequences of a war increasingly defined by attrition, technological adaptation, and the unrelenting calculus of survival, by early 1943. Japanese engineers were scrambling to address the mounting losses of their prized G4M bombers. The stark reality of Guadalcanal had forced a re-evaluation of the aircraft design, but the solutions available were painfully limited. Mitsubishi's technical teams knew that the G4MS fundamental vulnerability, the unprotected fuel tanks, could not be fully corrected without sacrificing the very range and payload that had defined the bomber. Yet something had to be done. The weight of attrition, the loss of trained crews, and the increasingly competent American fighter opposition demanded at least partial mitigation. Starting in March 1943, incremental changes were introduced. Thin rubber sheets were installed beneath the wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located, intended to slow the rate of fuel leakage in the event of small-caliber hits. These sheets offered minimal resistance, barely delaying the inevitable spread of fire from tracer rounds or cannon shells. The modification reduced top speed slightly and trimmed the maximum operational range, but Japanese commanders accepted the compromise. They had no choice. The strategic reach of the G4M was vital to supporting operations across the Pacific. Without range, Japan's long-distance strikes on Allied positions would be impossible. Despite the changes, the bomber remained perilously exposed. Crews continued to fly missions knowing that a single well-placed round could ignite the fuselage in flames. The airmen understood the stakes, yet military culture demanded obedience, courage, and duty above personal survival. Combat reports from mid-1943 paint a harrowing picture. Formations of Betty bombers approaching Allied positions often returned in fragments, with surviving aircraft bearing the scars of fire, shrapnel, and catastrophic damage. The attrition rate was staggering, and each loss represented both material and human costs that Japanese industry could barely sustain. The Americans, in contrast, had adapted quickly. Intelligence teams analyzed G4M flight patterns, formation tactics, and vulnerabilities. Fighter squadrons intercepted Betty formations with deadly precision, targeting the wings and fuselage where fuel tanks were exposed. The once feared bomber now became a predictable target, its deadly efficiency neutralized by the combination of tactical awareness and superior aircraft performance. American pilots even gave it grim nicknames like Flying Zippo and Flying Cigar, reflecting the certainty of fiery destruction upon receiving even minimal damage. Operations during 1943 highlighted the cruel arithmetic of Japanese design philosophy. The very elements that had enabled the G4M to dominate early in the war, range, speed, and payload, had become liabilities. Extended missions over increasingly well-defended areas exposed crews to continuous risk. The incremental modifications, while theoretically helpful, could not alter the fundamental vulnerability embedded in the aircraft's design. Each sortie was a gamble with survival hanging by the thinnest thread of luck. By the end of 1943, the attrition of experienced crews was accelerating. Replacement pilots, often rushed through abbreviated training programs, faced combat conditions that veterans had struggled to survive. Operational losses compounded, undermining Japan's ability to sustain effective long-range bombing operations. The Betty bomber, once a symbol of technological audacity and operational reach, had transformed into a cautionary instrument of attrition warfare, a deadly machine that could strike distant targets, but rarely bring its crew home alive. The limitations of design, compounded by evolving American air power, signaled a turning point. The stage was set for 1944, when further attempted redesign. The G4M Model 3 with self-sealing fuel tanks were arrived too late and in too small numbers to alter the course of the war. The story of the Betty bomber had become one of tragic calculation, where technological ingenuity collided with the unforgiving arithmetic of combat, and where the cost of performance without protection was written in fire across the Pacific sky. By late 1944, Japanese engineers finally introduced the G4M Model 3, a version designed to address the fatal flaws that had plagued the bomber since its debut. This variant incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks, an innovation intended to reduce catastrophic fires from battle damage. The tanks were smaller, accommodating only 4,490 liters compared to the 4,780 liters of earlier models, and the additional weight of the sealing material reduced maximum range by more than 2,000 kilometers. While these modifications were theoretically promising, they arrived too late, and in numbers far too limited to affect Japan's war effort. Only around 60 to 91 aircraft were produced before the conflict ended, a fraction of the thousands of Bettys that had already been destroyed. The late introduction of self-sealing fuel tanks was a clear acknowledgement of the bomber's deadly vulnerabilities, but it was also a testament to the persistent conflict between design goals and operational realities. By 1944, Allied air superiority was overwhelming, and American fighters and anti-aircraft defenses had mastered the vulnerabilities of the G4M. No modification, no matter how well conceived, could overcome the stark reality that Japanese crews faced near certain death in sustained daylight missions. The strategic advantage that the Betty had once provided, the ability to strike distant targets with devastating effect, had been entirely neutralized. Even with Model 3 modifications, sorties remained perilous. Any encounter with American fighters, or even moderate anti-aircraft fire, posed a mortal threat. Crews understood that survival was uncertain, but cultural expectations, duty, and the rigid military hierarchy demanded that they fly. Historical accounts and surviving veterans repeatedly emphasized the psychological burden of entering combat aboard aircraft that were essentially flying death traps, capable of igniting at the slightest hit. The courage required was extraordinary, but so too was the tragic inevitability of losses. The final operational use of the Betty also highlighted the aircraft's symbolic transformation. On April 18, 1943, a G4M bomber carried Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, on a mission that would end in his death. American forces, relying on intercepted communications, executed a precise interception with P-38 Lightning fighters. The G4MS unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that Yamamoto's plane would be destroyed once engaged. The mission underscored the lethal intersection of intelligence, pilot skill, and the inherent vulnerabilities of the aircraft. By August 1945, the Betty's role shifted entirely. Two white-painted G4M transport variants, bearing green crosses to indicate peaceful intent, carried Japanese delegates to negotiate surrender terms. The very aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field, wreaking havoc on American air power, now symbolized Japan's submission. These final flights captured the complete arc of the Betty's history, from a fearsome instrument war to a vehicle of diplomacy, an evolution defined not by its design brilliance, but by the consequences of the choices its designers had made regarding range versus crew survival. The G4MS legacy is one of contrasts, unmatched range and operational reach, brilliant aeronautical design, and devastating vulnerability. Its story serves as a cautionary tale about the human cost of prioritizing capability over survivability, where technological achievement collided tragically with the realities of combat. The Betty's flame-lit trails across the Pacific are reminders not only of Japan's strategic audacity, but also of the irreplaceable lives sacrificed in pursuit of performance. The final chapter of the Betty bomber story unfolded not over distant battlefields or flaming skies, but in a quiet, somber display of surrender. By August 1945, the aircraft that had once opened the Pacific War at Clark Field now carried Japan's representatives to negotiate the terms that would end the conflict. Two white-painted G-4M transport variants, bearing green crosses, lifted off from Sugi Airfield. They were no longer weapons of war. They were symbols of submission, flying under the scrutiny of the very forces they had once sought to destroy. The contrast was stark. The same cylindrical fuselage, the same long wingspan, the same engineering brilliance that had enabled attacks spanning thousands of kilometers, now carried diplomats instead of bombs, passengers instead of payloads, hope instead of destruction. Lieutenant Den Sudo piloted one of the aircraft, known as Baton 1, while the second Baton 2 flew alongside. Their flight to Ishima covered roughly 1,000 kilometers, well within the aircraft's operational range, even in transport configuration. The journey was escorted by American fighters, ensuring both safety and strict adherence to the flight path. Every detail of this final mission reflected the dramatic reversal of roles. The bombers that had once terrorized American and Allied forces were now under protection, their deadly potential dormant, their purpose transformed. This transformation from instruments of mass destruction to vehicles of diplomacy encapsulated the Betty's entire wartime trajectory. The aircraft had achieved extraordinary feats in the early years of the Pacific War, sinking capital ships, projecting Japanese power across vast distances, and demonstrating the audacity of Japanese military engineering. Yet, its vulnerabilities, the unprotected fuel tanks, the lack of armor, the minimal consideration for crew survival, had made it a death trap once sustained opposition emerged. Thousands of Japanese airmen had paid the ultimate price for a design philosophy that valued range and performance above human life. The production numbers and loss statistics tell the final, sobering part of the story. Approximately 2,400 Betty bombers were built across all variants, but by the end of the war, only a handful remained operational. Thousands of aircrew perished in missions that became increasingly suicidal as American air power grew. Every advantage of speed, range, and payload was negated by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. Survival depended entirely on avoiding enemy fire, a gamble that grew impossible by 1943 and 1944. Yet, even in defeat, the G4M stands as a testament to a design philosophy rooted in strategic priorities rather than human preservation. Major McCoy's examination of the intact Betty at Clark Field in 1945 revealed the deliberate choices that defined the aircraft. Unprotected fuel tanks for maximum range, minimal weight for speed and payload, and a focus on mission accomplishment above all else. The aircraft was not a failure of engineering. It was a precise fulfillment of the requirements imposed by Japanese naval strategy, executed with meticulous calculation. The only failure was the assumption that limited opposition would continue to protect the crews from the deadly consequences of those choices. As the white Betty bombers touched down carrying surrender delegations, the full arc of the aircraft's history was clear. From fearsome weapon of war to symbol of capitulation, from deadly precision to diplomatic conveyance, the G4M had shaped the Pacific War in ways both immediate and tragic. Its story is a reminder that brilliance in design cannot compensate for disregard of human vulnerability, and that the cost of prioritizing capability over survivability is measured not in kilograms or kilometers, but in lives lost. The Betty bomber's legacy endures as a lesson in engineering, warfare, and the human price embedded in every strategic decision.